No.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. On behalf of Nathragas USA, I welcome you all to the 5th meet of the Sikh Women Book Club 2023. To give a brief orientation towards Nathragas, I'd like to state that Nathragas is an organization that is committed to the cause of exploring Shabad tradition. Nathragas has been working in Sri Amritsar since about a period of 3 decades now. And the domain of Nathragas's working happens to be Sikh research, literature, creative arts, and philosophy. Nathragas USA was launched to take forward the vision and mission of Nathragas Sri Amritsar in 2021. And since then, Nathragas USA has been fostering the cause of engagement with local communities, giving them a platform to present their research and present their creative insights, as well as literary activities that Nathragas USA organizes periodically. The Sikh Women Book Club effort was launched in 2022, and this effort is inspired by the desire to offer a community-based platform where Sikh women and women in general can come and access and mediate and talk about their insights that they've gleaned from important texts that have faced the human civilization's journey of the mind. In 2022, we, as a group, studied the texts from domains of creative imagination and mysticism. And in 2023, we are collectively reading and studying a few notable texts of the world's knowledge tradition. As we continue this effort, today, I'll be presenting a talk on Pilgrim's Progress, which is a very famous work by John Bunyan. Prior to today's talk, in earlier part of the year, we've had 4 talks. We have had a review on the Dhampada, which is an important Buddhist text. We have had a talk on Srimad Bhagavad Gita, which is an important Vedantic text. Lotus Sutra, which is also an important Buddhist text, as well as Minhajul Abidin, the way of the worshipper, which is an important Islamic text. Today, I'll be presenting a talk on Pilgrim's Progress, which is an important work in the Christian tradition. I believe that a work of literature receives a certain hallmark of glory when its nature is such that it inspires our existential life or day-to-day life to seek a higher life, or what we call the transcendental life. And a great work of literature, a glorious work of literature, is such that it makes the reader ponder over the ephemerality or the short-livingness of the former of existential life. And it instills in us a longing for a life that can last beyond the bounds of space and time. So such a great works of literature have that ability to instill in us a longing for higher life, wherein we are striving beyond the existential life. I also believe that the literature, such glorious literature, by virtue of holding an author's hard-earned gains of soulful earnings, is able to pass some of those gains to the reader of that work. This is also a hallmark of a piece of glorious literature. Pilgrim's Progress, undeniably, is one such work of Christian literature, and it was written by John Baptist, who was a preacher in the late 18th century England. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, who's a Baptist teacher, also of around 18th century, continues to be revered as a high figure in several Christian denominations, and he has been called the preacher of preachers. And Spurgeon says of the Pilgrim's Progress, quote, "Next to the Bible, the book that I value most is John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress." He says that I believe I've read it through at least 100 times. It's a volume of which I never seem to tire. And the secret of its freshness is that it is so largely compiled from the scriptures. It is really biblical teaching put into the form of a simple yet striking allegory, unquote. So as we move further in this talk, let's pay attention to the etymology of the term pilgrim. The term pilgrim has several roots behind it, beneath it. Some of them are pelerin, which is an old French word, the late Latin word peregrinus, a classical Latin word called peregri, and Proto-Indian European root per. In spite of all these roots associated with the word pilgrim, it is interesting to note that all of these roots mean a journey. Some sort of a journey, some sort of a wandering from one locale to the other. To me personally, as I looked inside to find what I believe a pilgrim is, my current definition is that a pilgrim is someone who is in search of a yet unexperienced state, which the pilgrim believes will alleviate an intolerable burden that he or she is carrying. The pilgrim state is such that the status quo is not acceptable to him or her. And staying back in the status quo, it looms dispel for him or her to such a degree that setting out on the journey is the only avenue that the pilgrim has to restore life to oneself. And anything less, in my opinion, does not set one on true pilgrimage. If the pilgrim is content with the current life and is not restless enough that the current life ceases to hold meaning, the pilgrimage will not start. If a pilgrimage is done in any other mindset, then it'll merely end up being a ritual which will be done for the sake of adherence to a prescribed code of conduct according to a particular religious tradition. But it won't be a pure pilgrimage into oneself. Without there being an intolerable burden, therefore, on one's soul, I repeat, a pilgrimage I do not believe can start. I'll now talk about the Pilgrim's Progress in brief and the backdrop in regards to when Bunyan wrote this text. Pilgrim's Progress is the story of a seeker. His name is Christian. He begins reading the Bible, simply referred to as the book on in the talk that I'll deliver. I might refer to it as just the book on few occasions. So Christian is awakened to the realities of sin and judgment. And as he continues to read the book, the Bible, his distress and conviction enhance, and they take the form of a great burden that starts to weigh heavily on his back. He realizes that there are fearful consequences of sins that have come to his mind as he has read the Bible. In other words, the act of reading the Bible has revealed to him the various sins that the scripture of Bible helps him locate in his own life and in his own self. That's a very important contribution that a scripture makes, is that its reading reveals to mankind the sin that the mankind was carrying. So he realizes that there are fearful consequences of sins, and he knows that he, his family, and city will be condemned unless there is some way of escape that can be found. The part 2 of this work then tells us of the journey of his wife. Let me back up. The part 1 of the Pilgrim's Progress talks about Christian's journey to the city of what they call as the city of Celeste, or the celestial city. He starts his journey from the city of destruction, and he proceeds onwards through the various trials and tribulations and experiences to ultimately then reach the celestial city. The part 2 of this work tells us of the journey that his wife Christina takes. In part one, when Christian implores Christina and his children to come on a journey with him, they are not in that mindset yet, in that state yet, that they believe in Christian, that they believe that there is even such thing called as a pilgrimage or a journey. But in part two, it dawns on Christina that there is such journey and there is a need of that for her and her children. So she sets herself and them out on a journey with her four sons and an acquaintance. So John Bunyan wrote this allegory during the time he spent in Bedford jail. Bedford's a town in England. And this jail was referred to in those days as a den. After the Restoration in 1660, Restoration was basically an event that happened in the 1660. It bode the return of monarchy to England. Before that, monarchy had disappeared from England for some time. And then in 1660, monarchy returned to England. So after this restoration happened in 1660, Bunyan was arrested for preaching the gospel in a nonconformist church. Nonconformist church is a term that is a church that is used, that a term is used for those churches that are separate in principle or opposed in principle to the principles held in the Church of England. So Bunyan was arrested for preaching the gospel in a nonconformist church, and he spent most of the next 12 years in jail. It is there that he wrote his autobiography, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, which spoke of how God had graciously pulled him from a state of death to a state of life. And then he began to shape his experiences of coming to faith in Christ and suffering into the allegory, which he entitled The Pilgrim's Progress. In 1672, Charles II granted a declaration of indulgence for dissenters, and Bunyan was released. He then again began to pasture a group of believers in Bedford, but his freedom did not last forever. In 1675, the king was pressurized to recant his declaration, and Bunyan again got imprisoned. And then in 1675, he started to work again on his work, Pilgrim's Progress, and this was finally published in 1678 when Bunyan was again released. So Pilgrim's Progress is a personification allegory where the characters of the allegory, they have deep symbolic meanings. These characters come out of the author himself, as well as those experiences that he has had in the journey of his life that have influenced him in a profound way. His personal experiences, his personal insights, his values, etc. All these take the form of characters that come in Pilgrim's Progress. Some of the main characters that Christian meets while he takes this journey onwards are first, Evangelist. Evangelist is a messenger of God who guides and instructs Christian on how to begin and continue his pilgrimage. Evangelist represents the role of the gospel and the ministry in leading people to Christ and encouraging them to stay their way. Christian meets two characters called Obstinate and Pliable, and both of them actually try to persuade him to return to his city, the city of destruction. Obstinate is stubborn, and he refuses to join Christian's reason for starting the pilgrimage. He flat out refuses, and he actually represents those that are hard-hearted and reject the gospel. He represents those who reject the higher truth and the word of God. Now, Pliable is easily influenced. He agrees to go with Christian, but he soon gives up when he starts to face difficulties. In fact, he chastises Christian for setting him on such a journey wherein he had to face so many perils. So Pliable represents those who are superficial and unstable in their faith. They're in their faith in certain circumstance, and then they are not in their faith when certain other circumstances transpire. There is an important character called Mr. Worldly Wiseman. Mr. Worldly Wiseman is a character who meets Christian near the town of morality. He advises Christian to abandon his dangerous journey and advises Christian to seek salvation by following the law and doing good works. Because in the worldly wise man's mind, following the law and doing good works are enough of a mechanism to find salvation. Mr. Worldly Wise Man represents those who rely on human wisdom and self-righteousness only, and they do not believe there is such a thing called God's mercy and grace in life. That is an important part of one's salvation's journey towards one's salvation. Christian also meets a character called Goodwill. He is the keeper of Wicket Gate, which is the entrance to the narrow way that leads to the celestial city. Goodwill welcomes Christian and helps him through the gate. He represents God's kindness and favor towards those who are seeking God. And there is a character called Interpreter, a wise man who lives in a large house along the way and shows Christian the various rooms and objects that represent spiritual truth. And he represents the Holy Spirit, which, according to Christian Trinity, teaches and enlightens believers through God's hard work. Now, there are other characters such as faithful, hopeful, giant, despair, and shining ones, etc., that meet Christian on his journey. Similarly, Christina meets many characters on her journey. Some of them are those which Christian met on his journey, but she does meet some characters which are exclusive to her journey. For instance, she meets a character called Greatheart. Greatheart is a brave and faithful guide who accompanies Christiana and her children on their pilgrimage. He protects them from many dangers and enemies, such as the giant Grim, the giant Maul, and giant Slave Good. He explains to Christian and his accomplices the meaning and significance of various places of the events along the way. Giant Heart represents the role that a pastor or any mentor plays in leading and supporting the believers on their spiritual journey. That's what the Great Heart represents. Mercy is a young woman who joins Christiana and her children at the beginning of their journey. She is Christiana's friend and companion, and she later becomes the wife of Christian's eldest son, Matthew. She represents the virtue of mercy and the gift of friendship in life. Mr. Ready to Halt is now the pilgrim on Christiana's journey. He walks with crutches because of his lameness, but he does not give up on his journey. This character particularly resonated with me. I used to wonder as to what happens to those who are weak in their physical body, such that they believe that their mind is not able to pursue the transcendent with as much vigor as perhaps a man who has a whole body is able to. But the spirit of ready to halt is very important to note, is not the one that's halting. The ready to halt is representing that character who has physical disabilities, but does not have spiritual disabilities necessarily. So Mr. Ready to Halt, again, represents those who may have physical disabilities or challenges, or mental disabilities or challenges, but they are the ones who have kept their faith preserved in God. Some of the other characters that Christiana meets are Mr. Brisk, Mr. Feeble Mind, Mr. Ready to Halt, Mr. Valiant for Truth, etc. Now let us go into the plot of the book. Now, I will say, since the plot and overall import of this work is rather immense, that due to constraints of time and due to having the desire to provide to this audience at least certain concrete takeaways from my reading of the book, I'm resorting to picking up a few scenes which particularly resonated with me when I read this book 2 times. And I would like to share with you the views that spurred in my mind as I read those scenes. So I'll share the scenes with you, and then I'll speak of my thoughts that spurred in me upon reading those scenes. So there is a scene in Christian's journey where he comes to the house of the interpreter so he can seek some help for his onward journey. Interpreter takes Christian to a large parlor that was full of dust, which had never been swept. The interpreter calls for a man to sweep the floor. And when the man does so, dust flies in the room and it starts to choke Christian. Then the interpreter asks a lady who happens to be standing in the parlor to bring water and sprinkle, which when she does that, the parlor is cleaned. So the interpretation of this scene that interpreter offers to Christian is that the parlor here resembles the heart of a man that was never sanctified by the sweet grace of gospel. He says that the dust is his original sin, an inward corruption that defiles a whole man. Now, he who began to sweep the floor first was the law. But then she who brought the water and sprinkled it was the gospel. When the law in action made the dust or the sin to fly about in the room, the heart could not be cleaned. On the contrary, it revived and put strength into the sin because it starts to fly around and choke Christian as a pilgrim. However, the damsel, in sprinkling the room with water, upon which it was then cleaned with pleasure, sowed through the water gospel in the heart of the one who has sinned. And therefore, in planting the gospel in the heart of the sinner, is the sin subdued. So the key takeaway from the scene is that for a revelation or a higher truth to settle in one's heart, the heart must do the preparatory work of purging its impurities first. Now, one of the key contributors of our journey is our ego. The traditions of Buddhism and Hinduism, they hold the general view that ego is an obstacle to enlightenment. They believe that this should be transcended or it should be resolved to realize our true nature. It is interesting to note that traditions such as Christianity and Islam do not necessarily reject the ego. They believe that it must be transformed, that it must be changed to purify it. And their belief generally is that ego can be aligned with the will of God or the higher self, and we can make the ego serve a greater purpose. I believe that we may need to search for our personal path on what treatment do we think we need to give to our ego. Do we believe that ego must be transcended, meaning it should be totally obliterated towards the seeking of salvation or towards the seeking of the higher life? Or do we believe that it needs to be purified through certain ways that we can take our journey forward? I think the answer is where we ourselves need to seek a personal answer. Because in the world of pilgrimage,
Actually,
when we set out on pilgrimage, the setting out is done by the soul, by the lone us. We do meet fellow pilgrims on the route, but the relationship with ego that one has is very personal in nature. So incidentally, this is a clarity that we will have to gain for ourselves to determine what accord do we give to our ego. Because through the relationship with it, or through the relationship abandonment of it is our journey going to start? So how do we start our journey? And in which way is a very personal question that we all must attempt to answer. Next, I'll take you on to one of the other scenes where interpreter takes Christian to a place where there was fire burning against a particular wall. And against the wall, there was a person standing who was casting water upon the fire to quench it. But interestingly, the fire wasn't quenching. The fire was burning higher and hotter and bolder. The interpreter then takes Christian behind the wall. And there he shows Christian of a man who's standing behind the wall. And that man is actually, he has a vessel of oil in his hand, and he's putting the oil in the fire. The interpreter explains to Christian that this person who's standing behind the wall and is putting oil is Jesus Christ. And he explains to him that the scene means that the fire is the work of grace that is wrought in the heart, and he that is casting water upon it and is trying to extinguish that perception of grace, that existence of grace, is the devil. So he explains by further stating that Christ, who continually with the oil of his grace is forever working to maintain the work that he has already begun in our hearts. And, it's something that he has set us onwards with. Now, no matter what the devil does, that fire of grace is going to be continuously be working, because it is being handled by Jesus Christ himself. And the reason that the man stood behind the wall to maintain that fire is to teach us that it is hard for the tempted to see how this work of grace is maintained in the soul. For example, what I take of this is to mean that we take literal impressions. We see what is happening in front of our eyes, and we take what is happening in the front of the eyes to mean whatever it means to us. We are in many ways still bound by the shortcomings and certainties that we seek. Our senses reveal to us, or not reveal is not the right word, our senses show to us certain happenings, and we believe what our senses show to us. Our parasenses, our mind senses, from where faith originates, from where trust originates, that is often put at the back end, to so much so we don't even see. So that's why it's hard for the tempted, by tempted I mean those who only rely on their physical senses, it's hard for those people to see how the work of grace is actually being maintained in the soul by someone who is higher, much higher than us. It reminds me of the Gurbani verse, a verse from Sri Guru Granth Sahib that says, Dekhe sune hadur sad kat kat brahm ravind, akirt kananu palda prab nanak sab bakshind. Now, the expanse of Shabad Guru does not lend to a literal translation. It does not lend to a fulsome import via literal translation, but I'll submit a suggestively overarching interpretation of this work to move our talk forward, that this means that seeing and hearing is always close at hand and pervades everywhere. And even the ungrateful ones, of which all of us are guilty, I'm very guilty, even the ungrateful ones, those who receive his blessings and gifts, who do not acknowledge that inheritance, he even forgives them and nurtures them. So palana, which is rearing and nurturing, and bakshana, which is forgiving, these are the pillars of the Creator's grace. And therefore they stand as emblems of his autonomous sovereign will. This will is not tied to the cycle of human karma necessarily, as the human condition, which is always evolutionary in nature and evades, staticism, and produces karmic output, that karmic output is bound to the limits of the chronological time, of the space and time that that person is at that time in. I do not mean to imply that the human has no onus of living a principled life, or that one does not need to comply with ways of conduct that keeps one's spirit high and sturdy and upright, or that one does not need to bear an accountability towards personal actions. Rather, what I'm suggesting is that human condition, it's always in a state of flux and evolution. There is something that might happen just this moment that might change us profoundly, that the action that we just did before this time transpired, that karma might just get nullified by just this action that is going to produce in the next moment because of something that has dawned on us through his grace. So, and Gurbani reminds us that perfect human conduct is untenable. That pullan andar sabko apul guru karta. The only one who's free, the only ones who are free from mistaken conduct is the Guru Parmeshwar and the Parbrahm Parmeshwar. So this is a very important scene that I think I highly recommend that those who do read this work read this scene a couple times and do some internal introspection to hear the voice that comes out. Now there is a work that it's called a book called The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul. It's a very highly acclaimed book. It was written by Philip Doddridge. And Philip Doddridge actually talks about various experiences of the soul through which the religion actually awakens in him, in the soul. So he talks of various types of souls, and he actually narrates their individual stories and experiences. A soul may be at a certain stage when religion plants in the heart and mind of such a soul what output transpires. A soul may be on the next leg of his journey. What transpires in that soul when that soul keeps the journey towards religion going onwards. And what about those who recede? He talks about those souls and their experiences as well. I highly recommend this book to you. I repeat the title. It's called The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul by Philip Doddridge. I'm sorry. There's a common pattern that, both Pilgrim's Progress and The Rise of Progress of Religion in the Soul, they enunciate. And that resounding message is that we set out on the journey ourselves. However, we cannot complete the journey in and of ourselves. We need the graceful touch of a spiritual teacher who will keep bestowing eternal wisdom on us. And that will lead us to the fruition of our pilgrimage. The third scene that I'd like to narrate to you is a scene where Christian, during one of the legs of his journey, his friend, he is one of the legs of his journey, and his friend Faithful.
That's her book she's writing. That's the book that she's writing.
Friend Faithful is walking aside.
But
Deep, may I request you to go on mute?
it's most Christ, and then she puts in.
So Christian is surrounded by his friend Faithful, and they are talking about this character Talkative, whom Faithful had launched a discourse sometime earlier. Talkative is a person, as the name suggests, is a person who only talks. He will talk the sky and the moon and the journey to sky and moon and back, but he's not much at all a practitioner. I'll read to you the excerpt of this particular scene. Christian responds to faithful. Faithful says, well, I see that saying and doing are two things, and hereafter I shall better observe this distinction. To which Christian responds, there are two things indeed, and are as diverse as are the soul and the body. For the body without the soul is but a dead carcass, so saying, if it be alone, is but a dead carcass also. And Christian says that the soul of religion is the practical part. What the word practical in Bunyan's time was called practic. So it says the soul of religion is the practic part. Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this: to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. And this talkative is not aware of. He thinks that hearing and saying will make a good Christian, and thus he deceives his own soul. Hearing is but the sowing of the seed. Talking is not sufficient to prove that fruit is indeed in the heart of life. And let us assure ourselves that at the day of the doom, man shall be judged according to the fruit he produces, not what he talked about. And it'll be asked of them, did you believe? But were you doers or talkers only? And accordingly they shall be judged. The end of the world is compared to our harvest. And you know, men at harvest regard nothing but fruit. Now, there is the tendency that we have, that we're often looking for outward influences to sort of guide us on what our journey should be. We grow up in our family, we see the environment around us, we start to emulate and mimic what others are doing, or the practices that they're following to pursue their own transcendent journey. And we start to emulate and mimic, and it goes on for a long time. And then we find ourselves being a bit dubious. We believe, we don't believe. It appears to be a dodgeball sort of an effect. And while I do not want to take the easy course of simply saying that it's ego at play, and the ego is propelling this view of ours. I do hold a sympathetic view towards our own state. And I believe that each one of us, by virtue of the specific gifts, capabilities that God has bestowed in us, that through those capabilities and gifts that he has almost always singularly afforded to us, that it's through those we need to see how we authentically practice our faith. One of the ways of authentically practicing our faith is to do authentic service. A service that perhaps only you can do because you have been blessed by some unique skills and capabilities, which when you actually look around, you do not find others having it. So to employ those skills and capabilities that you have in the service of yourselves and those around you is the authentic way of doing service. I do not say that conventional ways of doing service are to be discarded or to be looked upon condescendingly or in any lesser way. I'm using the word authentic. I'm trying to call upon the attention to the fact that each one of us has an ability to give authentic seva, authentic service, which exclusively associates to ourselves, which only and only we can give. And the onus is therefore on the human to first of all identify what those individual skills and capabilities bestowed on him or her are, and then flourish them, chisel them, work on them through your life. Do not give it back. Start the process of giving back too, but keep chiseling and building on that. That is the most sacred to you and only and only awarded to you. So it's almost like a heritage that the higher one bestowed on us. So it's our responsibility to care for it, to build it, to nurture it, and keep it going. There's an interesting work that's called The Reason for, The Sacred Pathways. It's a work by Gary Thomas. Gary Thomas talks about that, in his analysis that he has done, he talks about 9 types of persons that exist. And then he talks about how those 9 types of personalities can actually give service. One of the gains that one gets from this book is that sometimes we do have a certain type of disposition, but we do not know some of the ideas to serve, maybe. Or we know what gifts we have, but we do not know how to employ them in the physical life. Gary's book can give us some ideas. I repeat, the name of the book is Sacred Pathways by Gary Thomas. As we move towards the second part of this talk, I'll take 2 scenes from Christiana's journey now. We've had 3 scenes from Christian's journey. I'll take about 2 scenes from Christiana's journey in the interest of time. So there's a scene in Christiana's journey where she, Mr. Honest, and Mr. Greatheart are in a dialogue, and they're talking about those who think that pilgrimage doesn't have to start presently or right now. They're talking about those who believe that there'll be enough time in the end, when old age comes or something happens, and there'll be enough time to repent when our death is close. Now, I'm going to narrate that scene to you from the book. Christiana says, there are strange opinions in the world. I know one that said it was time enough to repent when they come to die. Greatheart says, such are not overwise. That man would have been a lot. Might he have had a week to run 20 miles in for his life, to have deferred that journey to the last hour of that week? To which Honest says, you say right, and the generality of them that count themselves pilgrims do indeed do thus. He says, I have been a traveler in this road for many a days, and I've taken notice of many things. First, that I have seen some that have set out as if they would drive all the world before them, who yet have in a few days died, as they in the wilderness, and so they never got sight of the promised land. He says, I have seen some that have promised nothing at first, setting out to be pilgrims, and that one would have thought they could not have lived a day, yet they proved to be very good pilgrims. Honest further says that I have seen some that have run hastily forward, that again have, after little time, run just as fast back again. He says, I've seen some who have spoken very little of a pilgrim's life at first, that after a while have spoken as much against it. I have heard some, when they first set out for paradise, they say positively there is such a place, who, when they have been almost there, have come back and said there is none. I've heard some vaunt what they would do in case they should be opposed, that have, even at a false alarm, fled faith, the pilgrim's way, and all. They've given up their pilgrimage on a false alarm. So the character Honest talks about different types of pilgrims and their behaviors that Honest has come across on that journey, because Honest has been a forever walker on that journey. So he has seen many pilgrims come and go by. Now, this is an important paragraph in many ways. One of the ways that it's important to us, that it tells us that those of us who are yet to set out on a pilgrimage, the paragraph alerts us to the experiences of others who have set out on their journeys, and assures us that the rules of a successful pilgrimage are much disparate, much different from those that are followed to win over the trials and tribulations of existential life. That the rules that we perhaps lay on ourselves to, to lead the existential life, those rules are very different than the rules that actually prevail and see us through on our journey to pilgrimage. Then there is, in wrapping up, I'll simply speak of one last scene, which, as a woman, it particularly resonated with me. And I see several women on the call. So for them, I read this. So there is a scene where a character called Gaius talks about what he thinks of women on their spiritual journey and what they are. He says, I read not that ever any man did give unto Christ so much as one groat, but the women followed him and ministered to him of their substance. It was a woman that washed his feet with tears, and a woman that anointed his body to the burial. There were women who wept when he was going to the cross, and women that followed him from the cross and sat by his sepulchre when he was buried. There were women that was first with him at his resurrection morning, and women that brought tidings first to his disciples that he was risen from the dead. And Gaius says, women, therefore, are highly favored and show us by these things that they are the sharers with us in the grace of life. And this reminded me of the fact that in the Sikh tradition, the Guru Granth Sahib's verses are in the voice of a woman's soul. We know of Bebe Nanki being the first human soul who witnessed the sacred in Guru Nanak. We also know that when Guru Tegh Bahadur arrived at Sri Harmandir Sahib, popularly called the Golden Temple, the priests at that time shut the doors against the master. And he turned and Guru Tegh Bahadur turned his back on the Golden Temple, the brick and mortar Golden Temple, and he bore away the Golden Temple in his heart as a holy vision. The true Golden Temple would have vanished forever from the city of Amritsar, was it not to the accord of Sikh women, who in their emancipated form followed the master and recited the hymns. He blessed them, and he blessed Sri Amritsar. And the Golden Temple was therefore restored to the mankind because of the Sikh womanhood. In the Islamic tradition, we know Khadija bin Khuwailid, who was the first wife of Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him. She was the first person to accept Islam as a religion, and she was also the first person to believe in his prophetic mission when he received his first revelation from the angel Gabriel in the cave of Hira. This is a very profound message for women in particular. I did want to share at least a couple more scenes with you, but in the interest of time, I'll take a pause here, and I will highly encourage you to consider reading this book. This is a book, when you search on the web, many people say that they have made it a practice to read this book every year, that they have it as a discipline in their lives to read this book every year. This is the book that is second most in relevance in Christian imagination after the Holy Bible. And there are pastors who have read this book over and over. And if we and I think it's as the children of the Shabad Guru, it's our profound mandate to be close to the Shabad, to be close to those experiences which take our journey towards the Shabad forward. I highly encourage you to consider reading this book. And at this time, I will take a pause and encourage any questions or any comments that members of the audience might have.
I actually had a question for you.
Yeah.
So the allegory refers to a doubting castle. So do you think that's really a place or a state of mind, or do you think it's both?
Yeah, the doubting castle is a state of mind, undeniably. And the doubting castle is a place which I believe it comes to us. We feel we have really been caught in the fangs of a state of thinking that we cannot get out of. And it could be any state of thinking, but a state of thinking that, takes away from us the desire to chant Nam, to seek the grace of God, to do our prayers. It's a state of mind where we are in such a commotion and such a, I would say, misery that even those who want to come to our aid, they're not able to approach us because we have built a castle of deprivation around us. So that's the state that the castle represents. And the giant despair is actually the character that guards it in this book, which is, of course, the giant despair does get slayed later on. And the people who were caught in the giant castle, the castle of despair, they were released. So which means that, one can interpret this to mean that it's a higher power or a higher grace that can actually release us from this state of deprivation into which we ourselves set ourselves into, but through our devices and means, we are not able to come out of it. So we need someone such as, a slayer who can actually kill giant despair and get us out of this castle. So it's a state of mind, in short. Yes.
I also had a question.
Please go ahead.
So in the book, I think Christian is described to be an everyman. So like, in what sense do you think that's true? Or like what extent?
Yeah. The immediate answer that comes to mind is that the seeking for beyond the temporal is present in us in some way or the form, in some way or the other. So Christian represents a pilgrim on the higher realm of life. He is seeking a pilgrimage to the celestial city, which is the highest state of mind, which when received, one unites with the Creator, with the Lord. So we all have certain tendency that moves us forward. And we all have a desire to move forward in some way or the other. We may be successful, we may not be successful, notwithstanding that. The every madness of Christian, basically, in my mind, enunciates that spirit in us that wants us to get liberated from the shackles of the existential life, where we're constantly living in the Kam, Krodh, Lobh, Moh, Ahankar domains. We're constantly living in happiness, or constantly living in sadness that comes at us when the happiness recedes. So we are always in this state of perplexed confusion, and our soul is never really at a rest, at a steady state for a long time. And so in all of us does desire some sort of a seeking for that can free us from these shackles. So that seeking for the higher is what Christian represents. So that's why he's called as an everyman, because he in a way is representing some state or the other of every of us, of each of us. If anyone has any further comments or questions, I highly encourage you to share those comments. I take the silence to hopefully mean that the talk and the work is a figure of inspiration of some sort for you all, and that you all will deeply consider reading this work and talking to this work and introspecting with it. At this juncture, then I'd like to thank you all for being an audience in today's meet of Sikh Women Book Club. Our next meet shall be conducted towards the last part of this month. The announcement will be coming out soon on the WhatsApp group that we have created. And we will also be posting details about that event on the Facebook channel as well as Twitter channel that Nath Pragas USA has. So at this juncture, on behalf of Nath Pragas USA, I'd like to thank you all for being our audience today. I look forward to having you all attend our next session as well. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.